LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic references to child exploitation material and child sexual abuse. Please listen with care.
Hello, I'm Dan Mullins, Executive Producer of Crime Insiders. Welcome to our Rewind series, where each Wednesday we feature an episode from our back catalogue. Yesterday was National Safer Internet Day, a global day of action bringing communities, schools, organisations and families from more than 180 countries together to raise awareness of online safety issues and work toward a safer internet. We thought it was the perfect segue to rewind to our interview with Andrew Patterson, who spoke to Brent about investigating offenders in the days before the internet. His insight is amazing.
Our initial involvement with Eric Samek was a tip-off about child exploitation material, and we had sufficient grounds from that tip-off to get a search warrant. We executed that warrant and we found some child exploitation material, so we arrested and charged him in connection with that. As a result of some of the publicity, we had a victim contacted us. He, by that stage, was a man in his 30s. So he came in and we knew from having reviewed the child exploitation material that it was almost all homemade by Samek, and there were quite a number of young boys featured in the material. Now, we, of course, had no idea who those young boys were. Samek was completely uncooperative and refused to assist with anything. This guy came in and said that he had been victimised by Samek when he was a young lad, along with other young lads in the area. So one of the aspects which turned out to be one of the most fascinating parts of the case was this guy, when we were interviewing him, I did the victim interview with him. He described, obviously, things that had happened, sexual things that Samek had done to him and other lads. And he then described this underground chamber. The chamber had these shiny walls and Samek would take them down there. So we went, once we'd got his evidence and done any follow-up we could, and we were never able to get any other victims in that case. There were a couple who were identified, but they wouldn't speak to us, which was obviously quite common with those sort of things. People want to put things behind them, and if people deal with things in a different way, of course. So we went back round to Mr. Samek's house again, another warrant, and this time we asked about the underground. We went right through the place like an absolute dose of salts, checking the structures and all the rest of it. Perth is built on a sand plain, so very, very few properties have any underground cellars or anything like that. So we thought it was a bit unlikely, but we put it on Samek, and he, of course, just refused to cooperate until such point as we pushed the envelope a bit and threatened to get the crowbars out and start breaking the jar of floorboards. And he ran a screwdriver along the crack between two of the carpet squares, which then hit a hidden switch, and the entire square came up as a trapdoor. And sure enough, there was a chamber underneath, and we went down into it. That was a bit of an eerie moment, I have to say, going down with the Maglite torch. But sure enough, it had shiny walls. It was galvanised metal on the walls, and the chamber had actually been built back in the 60s as a fallout shelter when that was a bit of a rage for some people. It was a salutary reminder that nothing is impossible, and always keep an open mind to listen.
Just if I could take a couple of steps back, Andrew, you mentioned that this whole investigation can be linked back to a tip-off that you received. Now, you were working in what we would call, I guess, each state has a child exploitation squad, child sex crimes unit.
Yeah, so back then the unit in WA was called the child abuse unit, and the team that I was in there was the paedophile investigations team.
Samek had no previous at that time.
Not
of course,
time, no.
Doesn't mean he hadn't been involved in this activity for a long time. How old was he, just if you...
From memory, at the time, he would have been in his 60s.
Goodness me. I mean, there's an offender who could have been doing this type of thing for decades.
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, and pedophiles are, the one offender type who will offend over an entire lifespan. Whereas, I mean, I've arrested pedophiles who are teenagers. I've arrested pedophiles who are very old men.
The gentleman who came forward as the historical victim, they estimated from the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse that when young children of the age of these young boys are sexually abused, if they report it, and of course tragically many don't, as you would well know, the average time frame in Australia is around 25 years for reporting.
That wouldn't surprise me at all from the work I did. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's quite confronting, isn't it, for the listeners to think a little fella, young girl, age 10, tragically being sexually abused today. If they report it, more than likely they'll be in their mid-30s at the time that they walk in to the station or decide, I can't carry this with me any longer.
Look, a lot of the work we did with the paedophile investigations team is our team was dedicated to paedophile investigation, what we define as pedophiles, rather than the intrafamilial child abuse, which is what most of the squad's work was. I mean, I have to say the majority of the victims we dealt with were male. And of course, for anybody who's been sexually assaulted, reporting it is difficult and traumatic. But I think, and this is a personal opinion, but I think it's borne out by my experience that I think for male victims, I think there's some added difficulties in relation to that. So
you're quite right, and you say that from your experience. And I think, goodness, Andrew, I spent 29 years delivering seminars in secondary schools around sexual crime and that type of thing, and there are incredible barriers to young women coming forward, or women per se coming forward. As you say, there are perhaps those and additional barriers for males coming forward in these situations. It doesn't in any way make their or anyone else's situation better, worse, or indifferent. It's just, as you rightly say, there's a lot of barriers to coming forward. The material that this SAMAC was accumulating tragically with these young boys, often I would imagine down in this sort of basement that he'd set up, was it purely, Andrew, for his own gratification, or was he part of a larger organisation?
No, from everything we could ascertain, it was purely for his own collection. So there was no indication we could find that he had any network connections with other pedophiles or had distributed the material.
No statute limitation with regards to reporting that?
No, there certainly wasn't in WA.
Yes.
I mean, one of the big challenges, of course, and we've already just alluded to changes in legislation, and of course, investigating historical sex crimes has a whole layer of challenge for detectives, because you obviously have to charge under the legislation that was in force at the time of the crime, not the legislation that's in force currently. So we all had these big tables with all of the criminal code provisions going back over the years as to when each provision had changed and what it had changed into, because there were quite significant differences as time went on.
Yes.
And you obviously had to find the right offence to charge with. So
it's interesting too, isn't it? And also there, I guess, the sentencing in the 80s, 90s and before paled in comparison to the custodial sentences that you would get for committing that offence, say, today. How's that balanced in a courtroom environment?
Back when I was doing the work, which was sort of through most of the 90s, I think the sentencing provisions had come a long way, and the courts were taking things a lot more seriously. Although, the provisions in relation, the specific provisions in relation to child exploitation material, it wasn't termed in those terms, they used the old-fashioned term, but those specific provisions only came in whilst I was in the team. Prior to that, you had to rely on the Indecent Publications Act. But, I mean, one of the big changes, and it happened probably around the time that I was joining the police back in the 80s, but whenever we were looking at these pedophiles, and a lot of them had prior records, but most of them had never done any time, because up until a certain point in WA anyway, any offences committed by a child went to children's court. Any offences committed against a child also went to children's court. So, and children's court obviously didn't hand out or very minimal prison sentences.
Yes.
So,
a cap of 2 years or something like that. Probably it's not even that.
I remember seeing things, pedophiles who'd gone up for horrendous crimes to the children's court and they get a 3-month prison sentence.
And just from a purely legal perspective, if a pedophile following one of your investigations was in court facing historical child exploitation or child abuse charges, and say the maximum sentence at the time under that piece of statute, under that law, was say 2 years imprisonment, but we move forward to now, and the same crime would attract, say, a 10-year imprisonment. How does the judiciary weigh that? How does that work? Can they apply an imprisonment term on today's expectations, or are they locked into the maximum for the crime at the time it was committed?
Well, certainly in the jurisdiction I was working in, they were locked into what was available at the time. I mean, some of the provisions, even the older offences, the available provisions weren't too bad. It's just because they had been traditionally heard in the children's court, of course, they weren't used. Whereas the district court and Supreme Court judges took a very different view, of course.
Yes.
So, there were some pretty hefty sentences handed out. Obviously, you'd certainly get defence lawyers trying to argue that, well, the matter's now so old and my personal view is that, well, so what? The fact it's so old is simply because, it's taken the victim this long to be able to report it. And as we know, there are plenty of victims who never, ever report anything.
So Eric Samak, in his 60s, I think you said, arrested, first time, charged, convicted. He would have received some form of custodial sentence?
He did for the sex crimes on the victim, yes. He didn't at that stage. The first arrest and the first conviction was the child exploitation material, and he didn't get a prison. They didn't back then. They simply didn't.
That is hard to believe, isn't it?
Well, it is, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you look at it now, and people who are convicted of possession of the material often do get a custodial sentence now.
Yes,
yes. And I think it's appropriate, and just to try and persuade other detectives on, because there was certainly a fairly condescending attitude amongst many police. So, but trying to explain to people, well, it's not just, exploitation material for people to look at. That's been created by victimising a child. To me, it is a serious matter. The system, well, I think across Australia now, things have improved vastly in that area. But back then, it was, as I said, when I first started in the squad, there was no specific offence provision anyway. That changed a couple of years later. So we started using the new provisions with gusto, but the penalties weren't there. Technically they were on paper. But back then, I think that it was all new to the judges as well, and the magistrates, and so they weren't handing out custodial penalties for it.
Coming up, finding a pedophile after a victim provided descriptions of an underground chamber with shiny chrome walls.
Andrew, if I could take you back to around 1992, you investigated a pedophile by the name of Kenneth Peter Osmond, an ex-scoutmaster who, amongst other things, targeted street kids and sexually abused them. Can you have a bit of a chat to us about this individual in this case?
Yeah, certainly. So Kenneth Osmond was, when I first got involved with that case, was already a convicted pedophile, scoutmaster previously, and that's how he'd accessed some previous victims. Some of the historic matters leading to the arrest were involved with that. But the element of interest was then that his modus operandi that he'd moved on to, because he was no longer able to get a position of authority dealing with kids, was he targeted street kids. So he lived on his own, like a lot of them, and he would basically target the street kids and offer them alcohol, drugs, etc. And then he would endeavour to commit sex offences on them. And we dealt with 2 or 3 pedophiles who that was their modus operandi, and of course they were banking on the fact that street kids typically wouldn't speak to cops because there's all sorts of tensions and relation problems there. It makes them far less likely to speak up, and obviously because they also have some fairly basic needs because they are on the streets, it also makes them easier to target from a pedophile's perspective in terms of offering them things as a lure. So he went inside for the charges that we were able to put on him, and inexplicably he elected to go mainstream rather than segregation. He went into maximum security, the Casuarina maximum security as it then was, and I think that's still a maximum security prison there. And there was another offender prisoner in there called Nolan, surname Nolan. Now Nolan, he wasn't a sex offender, he was an armed robber, old school, very violent man. And he was doing basically decades in there for everything he'd been caught for. Now, the connection then turned out to be that Nolan, his son, was a street kid. Now, what Nolan had heard through the grapevine was that Osmond had offended against his kid. Now, we were never able to prove that. We don't know. It was entirely possible. We were asked, as the coronial matter subsequently came up, to look into that. We were never able to prove it one way or the other. But given that we knew that Nolan's son was a street kid, that was all on the record, and the young fellow obviously had recorded himself as a lot of the street kids did, but we couldn't prove anything. Nolan, however, of course, had made up his mind, and so basically one day in the exercise yard, Nolan comes up to Osmond, and he's got a homemade knife from the prison. And basically, Nolan decapitated Osmond.
Geez, mate, that's a grisly end.
Well, it is, yes, absolutely. I mean, why any pedophile would elect to go into mainstream rather than go into segregation is beyond me. But anyway, that's...
Would it be, in hearkening back to some of the very enlightening comments that you made in our, discussing the previous case, would there be a naivety in the mind of the sexual offender going into prison that he needed protection because it was perhaps, now we know child sex offenders are just, they cannot be put into general population.
Well, no, and back then they generally weren't.
Yeah.
There was a whole segregation area within that prison. That was where all the pedophiles went, and the only other offenders that ever went there were the coppers who went in. So, because for the same reason, just to protect the coppers, the ex-coppers, by that stage.
Even that term, we're showing our age here, aren't we, Andrew? That term street kids is not a term that probably you would hear nearly as much now. In our time in the job, round about that time, it was quite an issue in a lot of the big cities and things. Kids
absolutely.
Who were... And I got to be honest. At the time, policing, you'd have a lot of trouble with the street kids with low-level crime and things such as that. And as young coppers, you probably didn't have the insight nor the inclination to sort of question, well, why are these kids living on the street? And of course, for many of them, they're escaping the type of conduct and behaviour that tragically was inflicted upon, some of them by this individual.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And as sort of slightly analogous to that, but I spent my last 18 months in the job in Vice Squad, and obviously some of that work was working with the girls who were walking the streets. And lo and behold, a couple of the young street walkers I dealt with were girls that I dealt with as young victims of child abuse several years before.
Yeah,
so
those connections are, and it's not like, and it's not until we have a longer period of time in the police, or even for some when they leave the police and you look back and you're thinking, goodness me, they were not looked after by anybody. They were often targeted by the police. They'd give the police plenty of grief. It's and like you're saying, they're not going to go running to the police to support them because that just didn't sort of really happen, be that right or be that wrong. And yet, of course, they're perfect targets for the likes of Osmond.
Absolutely. And as I said, there were other pedophiles that we dealt with who that was their MO as well, to target the street kids.
Andrew, through the mid-90s, 95, 96, you were part of an extensive investigation into child exploitation, which discovered and convicted a number of members of a somewhat notorious pedophile ring. Can you discuss your involvement in this operation?
Yes, certainly. So that was Operation Amulet. And just in terms of terminology, we tended to refer to pedophile network rather than ring, because it's ring sort of implies it's a circular and closed group, whereas we found with a lot of them that whilst there might be a main group, they'd branch off and there'd be connections around the place. So anyway, so in terms of, as we'd got the pedophile team was up and running as of 94, we obviously were then targeting as much as we could what we refer to as organised pedophilia or pedophile networks, as well as child exploitation material. So we, again, through some information we'd received, but then background research, there was a pedophile called Ronald Redden, who he had prior convictions as well for pedophile offences. So we went around one morning with a search warrant looking for child exploitation material. And I always remember that we actually got Redden out of bed with his father abusing us in the background. And the first thing Redden did was go to the fridge and crack a beer. But anyway, we went through his room, and what we found in there was this, it was an old, very large medical textbook, anatomical textbook. But it was sort of spread right out, looking very fat, and sort of in between pretty well every single page were photographs and pictures, all child exploitation material. In terms of the psychology of pedophilia, it was a classic example of what a hardcore pedophile does in terms of the material. So a whole range of material in there, but the material of interest in particular to us was the stuff that was homemade. So we obviously had a whole lot of background information on Redden because he was a previously convicted pedophile, and we had information on some of his connections that had been previously established. So we then set about identifying as many victims as we could from the material. And again, because we'd publicised the arrest for the child exploitation material, we then did get, a victim came forward, and we interviewed him at length. And the horror stories that he proceeded to tell us, we weren't even prepared for that level. He also identified, and this was another very interesting part of modus operandi, he also identified one of the victims who was a couple of years older than him, and most of the guys, a lot of the victims were his school friends, so they were all the same age. There was another guy, young guy, in there who was a bit older, but he'd already been offended against by this pedophile network, and he was sort of being used as a bit of a recruiter and a bit of a enforcer, if I can use that term, with the younger lads. So we ended up with around about half a dozen victims being interviewed, signing statements. We obviously charged Redden in relation to specific sexual crimes that he'd committed. We charged 3 other offenders around that time in Western Australia. And it's quite interesting in terms of when we think about circumstantial evidence and corroborating evidence. So one of them was quite a prominent businessman, and he had previously run one of the big hotels in Perth. The hotel no longer existed, had been demolished. But one of the things that one of the victims said to us was, this guy smoked these really unusual cigarettes. And okay. And he said, yeah, they were called Black Sobranis. We actually had to identify who the offender was because he changed his name from what his name was. So we're trawling through all of our police databases trying to find this character. And of course, he'd changed his name in the interim. And so we did, however, eventually find him, brought him in for questioning. He denied everything, and in terms of denied even knowing the lads. So I said to him during the interview, I said, do you smoke? And he said, no, I don't. I said, have you ever smoked? Oh, yes, I have smoked previously. Okay. Did you have any particular brand you smoked? And he said, oh, they were called Black Sobranis. That was enough for the jury. So he denied everything, denied even knowing these lads. But of course, that one piece of circumstantial evidence, that victim could not have known that unless he had come across this character.
Goodness, I mean, you'll have taken so many cases to be tried in front of a jury, many with probably far greater depth of evidence than that. Quite a pleasant surprise that a connection like that is just enough for a jury to go, yeah, that'll do. And
particularly since he was taking the line that I've never met him.
Yes.
Well, the jury thinks, well, hang on a minute. Yeah. You clearly have.
Yes.
So,
which is another thing, of course, when they're sitting in a police interview lying through their teeth like that can absolutely be quite advantageous when it arrives.
Yeah,
in court.
That was just but in terms, and it's an example I use sometimes when I'm doing investigation training these days and talking about different types of evidence and circumstantial evidence. It's an example I sometimes use because it's a classic case of a piece of circumstantial evidence, but it was just enough.
Just enough.
I mean, there were a couple of other bits of circumstantial as well, but that was the clincher.
Yeah. This investigation, correct me if I'm wrong, just going back to when we first started about this operation, started with a bit of a tip-off again, is that right? Or how did this start?
Yeah, so again, it was a tip-off about Ronald Redden having child exploitation material, and having been an offender in the past. And from memory, it was triggered, the informant had actually seen Redden out at a park and thought he might be up to his old tricks, I guess. And that was the impetus for them to ring. But the interesting thing, I'm thinking back on that one, the interesting thing that we did pick up straight on that one was that despite the fact that he had several previous arrests, no police had ever searched his house. And again, that comes back to, I think, the comment that you were making before, which I agree with you fully, is that traditionally, without specialist police dealing with those sort of offences, and it's either, you run a UMIL detectives or it's your GDs doing it, there's, okay, well, yeah, he's done that, right? Yeah, let's get the brief done, let's get him on and we'll get on to the next thing. Rather than that expertise, specialised knowledge in terms of, okay, these people pretty well all have souvenirs. They will almost invariably have child exploitation material. You might have to look hard for it, but it's there. And so that's why when we went round and executed the warrant in his place and we found this, and it wasn't just, the book was the most stunning example, and of course that led then to victim identification and it led to the entire operation. Because at that stage it wasn't an operation, it was just we were going after Redden.
You will have interviewed countless often young men, men not so young, coming in to sit down in front of you to disclose exploitation against them as kids, and these are confronting interviews to undertake.
I suppose the most straightforward ones were the ones who they wanted to report the matter. So in that respect, they had obviously in their own minds crossed a certain threshold. So they were prepared to come in and talk because they were the ones that ring up and say, I want to come in and talk to you. Obviously, you had to, apart from having to show a great deal of empathy and patience and understanding, also obviously making sure that there was never any hint of any judgment or anything of that nature. So I interviewed any of the adult males that would come in. We worked in the male-female partnerships in that unit. So my partner, who the female officer, so she was also specially trained in child interviewing. So if they were actually still young kids, but with your adult males, it's apart from explaining obviously the process, because typically people come and say, well, okay, I want to talk about this. Well, what's going to happen? And as you know, then talking through court process, and that's horrible for victims in a lot of ways. I'm not sure that. I mean, things have improved somewhat. Remote evidence and video evidence, and even back in the day I remember when they first introduced screens into the court, so the child victim sitting there didn't have to actually look at the offender. But from a detective's perspective, interviewing them, it was really just a case of having to be prepared to put the time in. I mean, the longest interview I ever did with the victim was 9 hours. That was just a killer. I mean, far more so for the victim, but even I was exhausted, mentally and emotionally exhausted by the end of that. But, talking them through it and, encouraging them that, okay, you can talk about it, because obviously there are particular aspects of the offending that they're very coy about, understandably. I have to say that in almost all cases that they were given an option if they wanted to speak to a female officer, but in almost all cases they didn't. They wanted to speak to a male officer. Obviously showing that level of patience with them, and also explaining to them that, as with any sexual assault victim, this is not your fault, this is not on you. And particularly with the pedophile victims, one of the aspects of pedophile modus operandi is to make them feel this is our secret. This, you can't tell anybody about this. This is our secret, and that element of shame. And that goes through that. The victim carries that forever. So that you've got to get over that barrier as well. But I'll tell you the thing that really sticks in my mind about interviewing those men was, almost without exception, they would turn around at some point in the interview and say, does this mean I'm going to be an offender? The answer is no. We know from all the statistics that the vast majority of victims never become offenders. But that was sort of I remember the first time I was asked, okay, well, no, it's highly, highly unlikely. But this was something that seemed to be burning in the mind of almost all of the men I interviewed. Am I going to be an offender? And that would affect their relationships. It would affect them whether they were going to have kids and all this sort of problems.
Andrew, I've just so enjoyed this discussion with you, mate. Thank you for those 13 years of service to the good people of WA, to all those kids that you lost so much skin going to bat for. Thank you for that, and thanks for coming over. I've really enjoyed the chat.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search LiSTNR Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening.